ladies and gentlemen, this is TPP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and I'll welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Now, you've probably heard of Putin's propaganda machine spinning stories about historical reunification and the liberation of oppressed Russians. But behind this twisted rhetoric lies a less discussed and altogether stranger motivation: Putin's panic over Russia's shrinking population. Russia's latest war seems less imperial ambition and more like Putin having a midlife crisis on a national scale. Now, the Russian despot is solving Russia's population crisis in the worst way imaginable, invading Ukraine, kidnapping children, and turning national anxiety into international atrocity. It's the Kremlin's creepy version of Make Russia Great Again, except in this case, greatness involves a great big gap in fertility. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report.
For the last 3 decades, bar a short stint between 2012 and 2015, Russia has seen a negative population growth rate. Since 2020, this issue has not been offset by a positive migration balance, which means that Russia is facing demographic collapse. Russian authorities have been well aware of this issue and have been for quite some time.
For Russia's successful future, for its development, there must be much more of us Russians, you and I. And we are talking, above all, about increasing the number of families with many children.
Prior to the 2020s, the Kremlin employed a wide range of policies which are meant to alleviate the country's demographic issues. Many of these, especially since 2007, focused on promoting benefits for mothers in the forms of subsidiaries or paid maternity leaves. There have also been improvements to Russia's healthcare system since the early 2000s, although it is still lagging far behind those found in Europe. Sprinkle in some propaganda about family values, and the end result was the demographic upswing between 2012 and 2015. This was short-lived, however, as none of the policies introduced by the government solved the fundamental issues. Coupled with the mortality rate exacerbated by the pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as a crackdown on immigration, it is unsurprising that Russia has backslid in this regard.
And now let's zone in on the East-plaining portion of our show. Russia's population has been in decline for quite some time now. Even though the Kremlin has been focused on the issue of birth rates, the true problems lies with the mortality rate.
The continuing population decline of the Russian Federation means that soon enough it won't have enough people to run its economy and wage its wars. Vladimir Putin has increasingly often spoken about boosting Russia's birth rates and has introduced various policies to facilitate that boost, but he seems to be ignoring the elephant in the room: Russia's mortality rate. Russia's birth rate is essentially comparable to Europe's, but its mortality rate is far, far higher. Part of the reason behind this is that cardiovascular diseases continue to be the leading cause of death among Russians, something Europe has been able to overcome with healthcare systems. Economic inequality has also led to a low life expectancy in Russia, with many people being left to linger in poverty. And of course, Russia's war in Ukraine has had a devastating impact on Russia's demographics. Some estimates put the death toll among Russian soldiers at 120,000, with another 400,000 injured. Yet despite these glaring issues, Putin obscures the true numbers and seems to be hesitant to even start approaching the problem, as it would not only be massively expensive for the Russian state, but would also require a change of plans regarding Ukraine.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Demographics are a problem from Berlin to Beijing, but Putin seems particularly freaked out by it, and he is right to do so. Russia is facing a dramatic population decline, projected to fall from 145 million to about 126 million by the year 2100. Now, basically, Russia is slowly becoming the world's largest nursing home. Putin's fixation with demographics reached peak cringe in 2021 when he lamented to a room full of Russian schoolchildren that if history hadn't been so mean, Russia would boast 500 million people today. Well, clearly Putin dreams big, but what is the solution? Well, instead of policies that genuinely support families, he's opted for what historians called a mourning war. Well, that means a brutal, archaic practice of forcibly replenishing populations by annexing neighbors and absorbing their citizens. It's like the weirdest possible version of a corporate merger, except you can't just opt out of it. Remember Crimea? When Putin annexed it in 2014, Russia immediately added 2.4 million residents, mostly ethnic Russians. Now he's trying the same twisted strategy across Ukraine, abducting thousands of children in what might be history's darkest population growth strategy. Putin is literally kidnapping children, claiming that he's saving them from Western decadence. But Vlad, nobody believes that you're starting an adoption agency here. You're clearly playing demographer at gunpoint. Now, however, Ukraine faces its own demographic catastrophe as well, likely even worse than Russia's. At independence in 1991, Ukraine had 52 million people. By 2022, that was down to about 41 million. And the war has sliced that number even further. 6 million Ukrainians have fled since Russia's invasion, and birth rates have collapsed. President Zelensky faces an agonizing choice: keep fighting a war that's decimating his population, or accept territorial losses for the chance at a demographic survival. Now, Putin's war hinges on a bizarre paranoid worldview that the West is somehow weaponizing low birth rates through feminism and LGBTQ rights to destroy Russia. Seriously, the Kremlin recently criminalized child-free propaganda. Putin sees declining populations not as a natural transition from poverty and patriarchy, but as a sinister Western conspiracy. Russia once defined its security in territorial terms, expanding endlessly across Eurasia. But today, it's all about demographics. For Putin's, fewer Russians mean less global power, so grabbing Ukrainians feel like securing Russia's demographic future. But here's the problem. Forcibly annexed populations rarely make for loyal citizens, as they might turn Putin's demographic remedy into a recipe for disaster. So Putin might be desperate to reverse Russia's decline, but forcibly annexing another country's population won't fix the core problem: a state that offers little hope, low prosperity, and fewer reasons to have children. Russia's true demographic crisis isn't a lack of bodies, it's a lack of belief in the future. And now, to shed more light on the issue is Mr. Paul Goebel, Distinguished Senior Fellow from Jamestown Foundation. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you for having me.
So today we are taking a look at Russia's demographic decline, and it does seem like Russia is running out of Russians. Now, this could be seen as something of a global trend, but just how much of it is kind of exacerbated by the war and the situation and the conditions of Russia?
Well, you're quite right. There is a global trend to declining birth rates, and Russia is certainly among the leaders in that decline. We've seen the birth rate, the fertility rate, the number of children per woman per lifetime, fall well below the replacement level of 2.2 there to 1.4 for the country as a whole, and 1 or even less than that in the major cities. The consequence of that is that the Russian population will decline unless Russia occupies new territories or unless it expands the inclusion of more immigrants, neither of which are desirable from the point of view of Russians or others. Having said that, Russia could improve its demographic situation if it were spending more money on healthcare and on extending life expectancy. But instead, it has chosen the cheaper and easier way of trying to promote a rise in the birth rate by funding teenage pregnancies and other and maternal capital, which hasn't. These policies have not worked very well, but they are cheaper and they make it appear to many people that at least Putin is trying to respond.
Right. Do you think that has something to do with the way that Russians are like kidnapping Ukrainian children, or trying to also kind of take people from wherever they try to annex?
Well, I think one of the reasons that Mr. Putin wants to expand the borders of the Russian Federation is to take in more people he can declare Russians. Since 2014, with the illegal annexation of Ukraine's Crimea and the expansion of Russian forces into the Donbass then and since 2022, the number of people living under Moscow's control has increased, and Russia includes those people, which hides the extent of the demographic decline of the country as a whole. It hides, but it doesn't eliminate it. The decline in the Russian population is so severe that even with those additions, the numbers of Russians are going down at record pace of about 1 million a year. And it's not unimportant from Moscow's point of view that the greatest declines in population in the Russian Federation are among the ethnic Russians rather than among the non-Russians. Non-Russians continue to have higher fertility rates than Russians do in most cases. So there's a shift away from Russian dominance of the population and a rise in the importance of non-Russians there.
That's very interesting. Why do you think, it came to be like that?
Well, first off, many of the non-Russians in the Russian Federation are Muslim, and Muslim culture promotes having children more than modern Christian culture does. So you have in the North Caucasus fertility rates above 2 or even 2.5, whereas among Russians it's down at 1.1 or 1.2 overall. That's a historical pattern, and it's been exacerbated by the fact that Russians have urbanized more than the non-Russians have. As a result, and urbanization, we all know, drives down fertility rates because people have to live in smaller apartments, and raising children is more expensive, so people choose not to do it. As far as the impact of the war itself on the Russian birth rate, I think we have to say this. Many people are now choosing not to have children because of uncertainty about the future, and Putin has increased that uncertainty by his aggressive war in Ukraine. Russian losses, population losses of dead and wounded have certainly further depressed the number, but they are not the primary factor at work. These are larger tectonic shifts that have been going on for some time. And we are going to see a Russia vastly smaller in population, even if it remains in its current borders by the middle of the century.
Right. Oh, I'm also curious about what you mentioned earlier. A lot of analysts also echo your sentiment that trying to boost fertility rate is not going to be as effective as trying to reduce mortality rate. But do you think that if that is the way they go about doing things, they'll just be facing an aging population somewhere down the line?
Well, they would. The thing is, there's one thing to simply worry about end-of-life treatment. There's another by trying to promote better health among middle-aged and early elderly populations who might very well continue to work and be productive in that regard. I think that we are not going to see Mr. Putin shift to lowering mortality rates simply because that's vastly more expensive and it's vastly more difficult because it requires challenging deep-seated cultural patterns, including overconsumption of alcohol, obesity, which has risen to about 60% of the Russian population. And so I think we're going to see this demographic decline of Russia continue, even though Mr. Putin is going to try to boost fertility rates. I don't think he can make up for the declines in population so far, because just as Russians have historically blamed lower birth rates on World War II when so many people died, we're now going to see in the future, 18 to 20 years from now, a further decline in Russian population precisely because of losses or the absence of men because of Mr. Putin's war in Ukraine.
Right, like you mentioned, there's a lot of factor going into the decline in Russian population. Do you think that there's a certain critical point which this becomes somewhat irreversible?
Well, I think the decline is irreversible. I think the size of the decline can be modified somewhat. I think that there's no reason to think that a sensible Russian healthcare policy couldn't reduce the declines from about 1 million a year now to perhaps half that number. That pushes off when a real crisis occurs, but it certainly doesn't end the prospect that it will come eventually. I think that if you had a policy of improving health care, of reducing alcohol consumption, of making medical care available to more people, rather than reversing all of those policies. Putin has cut the number of hospitals, he's cut the number of doctors, he's cut the number of medical points across the country. Fewer Russians can now get health care than they could. It will also help if he ends adventures like wars abroad, which take young men who are the most obvious potential fathers out of the marketplace, so that people will have a chance to think that they will be able to raise their children in peace, and the men will be there to become fathers. That all those things can improve Russia's demographic situation, but we see too many patterns internationally of declining fertility rates to assume that somehow Russia can find a magic bullet to solve this problem. It isn't there. Russia is in demographic decline. That's going to continue. How fast that decline goes will depend, importantly, on the policies that Mr. Putin adopts.
And how's the wartime economy and this Putin's war effort impeding these attempts at trying to curb the demographic crisis?
Well, if you focus on military production alone, you're taking a lot of men out of the marriage market, as it were, and birth rates will go down no matter what else you do. Reversing that is going to be hard. We see already that with the return of veterans and with the number of men serving in Ukraine, the divorce rate in Russia has skyrocketed, and that will continue because a lot of these men who've been at war will suffer from PTSD, and they will not be able to reintegrate into families. I think we're going to see the next 5 years, we will see accelerated declines of the Russian population. I would guess that would moderate if we have a Russia at peace with the rest of the world and more closely interconnected with the West. If that doesn't happen, then this decline will accelerate, and we will be talking not about declines of 1 million Russians per year as we are now, but perhaps 2.5 to 3 million a year. And that's 2% of the Russian population. If one imagines a country losing 2% of its population a year, that's like being at war. And in effect, what we see is Putin's general policies constitute a demographic war against his own population.
Right, but in all of this, Ukraine is also being forced to be a participant of the war. Do you foresee a very similar situation kind of burning Ukraine's population as well?
Well, in many ways, the situation in Ukraine may be even worse. The percentage of the Ukrainian population that's fled abroad is larger. The number Ukrainians are not choosing to have children as frequently as they did in the past. We see across this region declining fertility rates. So yes, Ukraine, if you look narrowly at Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine is suffering many of the same problems. The difference is this: the Ukrainian government, despite the pressures brought on by Putin's invasion, has tried to maintain medical care for its population. It has a population that is vastly more hopeful about the future, confident that it's going to defeat the Russians, and that's leading more people to choose to have children than would otherwise be the case. Again, you're seeing declines, and potentially, at least, they could be even more serious than in Russia. Right now, they're not, despite what Moscow claims, and I would expect them not to get worse unless the course of the war goes very much more against Ukrainians in the future.
All right. Thank you so much for your input and insight on the topic. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East I don't want to miss. More than 40% of Ukrainians said that they'd be willing to make concessions to reach a peace deal with Moscow. This is only under the condition, however, that it does not include a de jure recognition of Russian control of occupied territories.
The matter of concessions when it comes to a possible peace deal on the war in Ukraine continues to be a hotly debated topic. Some 48% of Ukrainians oppose even a de facto recognition of Russian control of the territories that its forces occupy in Ukraine, even if it meant reaching a peace agreement. 43% say they'd be willing to make territorial concessions but without formal recognition of Russian control. Even fewer Ukrainians are ready to accept a de jure recognition of the Russian occupation, as almost 70% are against it and 24% are open to it if it leads to peace. This poll by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology comes as Russia has continued to push for territorial concession from Ukraine as part of the ongoing negotiations. The Russian Federation currently occupies some 20% of Ukraine's territory, including Crimea and large swaths of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions.
Russia and North Korea are looking to tighten their military cooperation even further. The head of Ukraine's military intelligence has warned that Russia intends to help North Korea begin domestic manufacturing of Shahed drones.
The Shahed suicide drones have made a name for themselves during the war in Ukraine, and not a good one. These Iranian-made and designed UAVs have been one of the main tools utilized by the Russian military to sow destruction among Ukraine's civilian population and against the country's critical infrastructure. By giving North Korea access to them, it would allow Pyongyang to strike targets across the territory of its arch-nemesis, South Korea. Their use could potentially overwhelm the country's air defenses and even assist Russia in its war against Ukraine. Moscow and Pyongyang started cooperating when it comes to the military after their leaders signed a strategic partnership agreement last year. In 2024, North Korea sent thousands of soldiers to Russia's Kursk region to help push back Ukrainian incursion into the area.
A recent report by the International Trade Union Confederation paints a bleak picture of labor rights across Central Asia and the Caucasus. Georgia and Kazakhstan in particularly have found themselves under criticism.
The ITUC report warns that along with the rise of authoritarian practices, labor rights have been eroding among the former Soviet republics. Georgia in particular has experienced the most rapid drop in workers' rights as the Georgian dream continues its pivot towards authoritarianism. Recent laws have restricted not just foreign funding, but also various union activities. The political atmosphere in the country, with peaceful protesters being detained by the police, has also contributed to this dire situation. Kazakhstan is another country where workers have been faced with heightened repression, as Astana has dissolved independent workers' unions. The report also highlighted a pattern that labor rights decline most heavily in countries where political freedoms suddenly become limited.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.